Alright guys, Murphs here. And today we're going to talk about the 32 ACP or 32 automatic Colt pistol, also known as the 7.65mm Browning, depending on what country you're in. Now, in order to talk about this cartridge, we are going to cover some of its history. We're going to get into some data, some context for that data, and then also do a little bit of comparison before it's all said and done. Now, for history, in the late 1800s, FN decided that they wanted to diversify their portfolio. They wanted to jump from manufacturing bicycles into manufacturing firearms, going after lucrative military contracts. Now, in order to be able to achieve this, they would wind up contacting a rising star in the firearms industry, a man by the name of John Moses Browning. Now, as it would turn out, at the time that they contacted him, John Moses Browning already had a new design and cartridge in the works. This design would wind up being purchased by FN, and this would be the FN Model 1900, a semi-automatic pistol chambered in the new 32 ACP, or as it came to be known in Europe, the 7.65mm Browning, excuse me. Now, Colt would catch wind of this Model 1900, and they would express an interest as well, and they would wind up dividing the market with FN. So Colt would wind up getting the rights to be able to produce the Colt Model 1903 pocket hammerless, and FN would stay on the European side with their Model 1900, while Colt took the Americas, well, specifically North America. Now, in Europe, the Model 1900 would wind up scoring some military contracts as well as police use, in addition to being fairly popular in the civilian market. In the United States, the 32 ACP would not necessarily, and the Colt Model 1903, would not necessarily become standard issue military options, but it would find quite a bit of popularity amongst the shooting public. Now, something to keep in mind is that the 32 ACP would make the jump to many other manufacturers, and it would actually be adopted by many more militaries in their own homegrown designs, as well as being adapted to many more pocket pistol options. And really, I would say that the 32 ACP kind of made the pocket pistol market what it would eventually become. Now, this cartridge would see service in World War I. It would continue to see service into World War II. However, by the 1950s, it started getting replaced in a lot of different military circles, and they started going with 9mm or other more major calibers. On the civilian side of things, the 32 ACP would still hold some popularity. However, you would see that wane over the years, to the point where today manufacturers are still putting out new 32 caliber pistols. Taurus, Kel-Tec, Beretta all produce 32 caliber pocket autos. However, the popularity of the cartridge and the pocket pistol design have kind of been inversely related as time has gone on. All right, guys, that pretty much covers history. Let's go ahead and get into the data-driven portion so we can start a very long and drawn-out contextual data portion. Now, first off, let's go ahead and do size association. So, on the left is the 25 ACP, in the middle is the 32 ACP, and on the right is the 380. All right, now, let's go ahead and describe the 32 ACP cartridge. Now, this is generally a 60 to 73 grain projectile, which can be found in FMJ, hollow points, and ballistic tips in the case of Hornady critical defense loading. This cartridge is seated into a 17mm long semi-rimmed cartridge casing. This is very interesting. We don't really see a lot of semi-rimmed cartridge cases anymore, but in early semi-automatic pistol development, there were quite a few semi-rimmed options available out of the market. 25 ACP would be another outstanding example of a semi-rimmed cartridge. Velocities achieved out of this cartridge generally range from about 800 to around 1100 feet per second. However, there is going to be quite a bit of impact placed on barrel length in order to be able to achieve that. All right, so that's kind of that's sort of our stats, our data-driven portion of it. Let's go ahead and start segueing into our contextual aspect of this data and start discussing defensive options. That's the first thing I want to look at for this cartridge is going to be modern defensive options. So, for that, I like to use charts from Lucky Gunner. I really like Lucky Gunner in that they have spent a lot of time developing a wide body of really good data showing a lot of velocities, 5-shot strings worth of expansion, taking an average of all of the above, all that type of stuff. Now, something to keep in mind with our results here. We are looking at results out of FBI ballistic gelatin. The thing to keep in mind about ballistic gelatin is that it's calibrated to take into account all of the different densities involved in the human body. So when we talk about penetration distances in ballistic gelatin, we're not necessarily talking about one-for-one penetration distances in the human body. In addition to that, we are looking for penetration to be between 12 and 18 inches based off of FBI standards, which for duty use, the FBI prefers to see 18 inches of penetration. In addition to that, when it comes to an expanding type projectile, the FBI prefers to see 1.5 times expansion out of that particular projectile in order to be able to get the most tissue damage possible in a self-defense type situation. So how does the 32 ACP fit into all of that? Well, for the most part, not that great. Though there are quite a few 32 ACP hollow point offerings out on the market, very few of them reliably get that 1.5 times expansion. And a lot of the ones that do get 1.5 times expansion do not achieve 12 inches of penetration. Now, there is a core bond loading that does achieve both greater than 12 inches of penetration and 1.5 times expansion, or at least very close to 1.5 times expansion, but that is one example out of quite a few. Now, this might be a situation in which actually going with an FMJ might be the better option. And this specifically because you may not necessarily get expansion. You're still only going to get a 32 caliber sized hole in your target. However, you will for sure be able to penetrate deep enough to be able to get to things that matter, to be able to put holes in things that somebody doesn't want to have holes put into to begin with in order to be able to get that fight stopping characteristic. However, this is there's a lot to be said about this expansion and penetration type dynamic here, and this is where your shot placement crowd might come in and be like, well, if you put holes in critical things, then it doesn't really matter how wide your expansion is and all that kind of stuff. And while that is very true, because first off, everyone who gets shot at inherently doesn't want to get shot, and then in addition to that, I find that I work less well or less good whenever it is that I have additional holes in my body that I wasn't born with. However, that's not necessarily a cocktail for winning a fight as much as a cocktail for being able to change the fight in your favor. It's not an instantaneous win, and especially when you take into account a lot of the adrenaline dump and all that kind of stuff that comes into armed conflict. Really relying or basing your entire concept around shot placement, good shot placement, is very dependent on you training to be able to maintain that high stress, good shot placement, and that is where most people fall short. So keep that in mind. This I don't necessarily like to say that powerful cartridges with high velocities and lots of mass and all that kind of stuff are the only things that are going to win fights, but I also don't necessarily subscribe to this theory that shot placement is the only thing that matters. At the end of the day, shots on target are what matter, and those shots on target disrupting as much tissue, damaging as much of the body as it can. But that's enough on that particular subject. Let's go ahead and get a little bit further into this contextual aspect here. So this might be an instance where going for greater penetration might give you a better result. That is something that is not unusual to find in the smaller caliber options. That's the same type of thing in the 25 ACP video. Now, developing enough energy, developing enough expansion, the 32 is definitely coming in very light on these prospects. What about, and this is purely looking at it from a defensive standpoint, what are some other things to take into account about the 32's design that might make it more advantageous to your average consumer? Well, one of the things to take into account is that 32 caliber pocket pistols are incredibly light, and this is because this is a light recoiling cartridge. Now, a lot of these pistols that we're talking about are recoil operated, so the equal and opposite reaction of the round being expelled is what cycles the slide in this particular type of semi-automatic system. And a lot of times what you see with those types of systems is that you have a very heavy slide or a very stiff spring in order to be able to counteract the rearward motion of the slide up until we have reached the optimal timing for extraction to occur. And that's one of the things you have to keep in mind with semi-automatic systems, is that you have a very interesting relationship with extraction and timing and all that type of stuff. If extraction occurs too early, you could have an out of battery detonation, which is not good for anybody. And that's kind of a worst case scenario. A more likely scenario is that if extraction occurs too early, you might have case head separation, because extraction is trying to occur while the cartridge casing is still ballooned up from the pressures in the barrel, and then you wind up ripping the cartridge casing. That's not good. That's why the timing aspect in semi-automatic systems is so important. You want to get it at a time when the cartridge casing has started to contract with the drop in pressure to make friction less and extraction more reliable. With a 32 ACP, you have a very light recoiling cartridge, very light cartridge itself. You can have a very light setup that makes it really advantageous for pocket carry. It's not going to weigh your pocket down and make it really stand out, the fact that you're carrying a gun. In addition to just in general carrying things for long periods of time are easier when they are lighter. And this is kind of one of the things that's kept the 32 ACP around, because as much as pocket carry may not be my favorite type of carry, the number one rule in a gunfight is to have a gun. And if that means that based on where you're going or how you're dressed or, you know, how quickly you had to leave the house or something like that, if that means pocket carry is a viable option to you, then at least you have a gun. You're not stuck in a situation where you're in a fight for your life throwing rocks. That's an important dynamic to keep in mind there. That is the advantage of the Pocket 32 Auto and why it's been able to stick around for as long as it has. So if you're prioritizing having a gun over having the best gun, I don't necessarily fault you for that. It's great. You know what? If all of us could get away with concealing and carrying a Desert Eagle, we would probably do that more often. However, what we find with people who carry big, heavy guns chambered in large cartridges is that a lot of times they wind up not having them on them. And that could potentially put them into not having a handgun available to them when they need the handgun most. So at the end of the day, the only gun in a gunfight that matters is the one you show up with. And if it winds up being a 32, there's some things you got to take into account, but at least you're armed. Now, of course, with pocket pistols and stuff like that, we're not talking about normal self-defense distance shooting, at least not from an accuracy standpoint. These guns are going to be a little bit harder to shoot. They're going to move around in the hand a little bit more. Most people's hands are going to be too large for 32 for any type of pocket auto, no matter what it is. So these wind up being more of like bad breath distance type defensive options, but it's still a defensive option. You're still meeting that requirement. Now, is that to say that there are not larger handguns that have been built for the 32 ACP? There absolutely have. There's a wide, the 1900, the Colt 1903, and then even more recently with the Beretta Model 81. However, these are not as common, and the sights are not as good as what you would find on more modern handguns of comparable size. So, yes, you get better than just little nubbins for sights, but they're not like night sights or anything like that. They're not what we would consider to be effective modern options out there on the market in the 32. Not as available as you would see in other chamberings like 9mm, 380 or anything along those lines. So that can make shooting these handguns kind of difficult in different situations. Not impossible, just difficult. All right, so that kind of covers the defensive side of things. What about the 32 ACP as a military cartridge? Kind of stepping back into history a little bit here. Well, the 32 ACP from a size and performance standpoint is kind of on trend for the early 1900s, which is to say that military handguns were not terribly potent, at least not in Europe. You're talking about a lot of very small cartridges, very short cartridges that might have very large projectiles, but rather anemic velocities and not a lot of energy output. Talking like 180 foot-pounds of energy, something around there. The 4.55 Webley would be an outstanding example in a revolver type setting, and then the 32 ACP would be what I would commonly pick for an example in the semi-automatic realm. Now, that's not to say that there were not potent or more potent semi-automatic pistol cartridges out on the market at the time. By the time the 32 ACP came out, the 7.63 Mauser had already been around for a couple of years. The 7.62x25 Tokarev is in the in the near future for military handgun development. Now, if you look at the American side of things, Americans have had a tendency to have larger cartridges than their European counterparts. The 38 Smith & Wesson, while by no means a potent cartridge in the modern sense, is a much bigger cartridge than a lot of its contemporaries from Europe. The 45 ACP, which is what the Americans would go to in the first semi-automatic handgun that they adopted, the Browning design model 1911, would also be another example of significant power in comparison to most of the cartridges coming out of Europe for the time. So, though the 32 ACP is on trend for World War I, even into World War II, it's definitely, in my opinion, not the best example of a military cartridge coming from the time. All right, so now let's continue a little bit more with this contextual conversation by going into our comparison portion. Now, I thought about comparing this cartridge against the 380 ACP. However, that's a tried and true. That's what a lot of people have done. So instead, I think I'm going to take a look at the 9x18mm Makarov, especially since this is another cartridge that's had quite a bit of military pedigree and is in a similar size to the 32 ACP, just a little bit bigger, both longer casing and also wider projectile. Now, the 9x18mm Makarov comes in loadings from about 85 to 90 grains, moving between 900 and 1100 feet per second. And this is kind of putting it solidly in the 380 category of velocity and at the higher end of the velocities that you would expect from the 32 ACP, also having, again, a wider diameter bullet. However, the issue you run into with the 9x18mm Makarov is that it has fewer options available out on the market, especially when it comes to defensive loads. Now, again, taking a look at Lucky Gunner's charts, they only have a few cartridges to be able to compare, and they do have a load that expands mostly well and even meets the penetration requirements of the FBI. However, for the most part, the other loadings don't really perform that stellar. Now, also, when it comes to finding 9x18mm ammunition, you're more likely to find FMJ than you are hollow points, and you're probably going to wind up spending a little bit more for those hollow points than what you commonly want to. But I could probably level that same consideration at the 32 ACP if we're being completely honest. Now, if we push this context a little bit further, let's discuss these cartridges and the handguns that they would be associated with. With the 9x18, we're almost solely looking at surplus firearms. Now, we can get drop-in barrels for like Glocks and stuff like that. However, I can't imagine what situation would drive me to change the chambering of my Glock over to 9x18 as opposed to whatever already standard and available mainstream cartridge it is chambered in. I don't know why I would do that. So, sticking with this discussion, we're just primarily going to be looking at things like Makarovs, P64s, and then also the CZ Model 82. Now, if you're saying that my choices here would be, say, a Kel-Tec P32 Pocket 32 ACP pistol versus a 9mm Makarov, I would sooner take the Makarov than the pocket pistol, if I'm being completely honest. At least the Makarov's a little bit bigger. It doesn't have the nicest sights, but it'd be a little bit bigger, a little bit easier to maintain recoil management and all that kind of stuff. Now, one of the issues we're going to run into with a lot of these Eastern European surplus pistols is that they're going to have heel releases, which are not a natural thing for a lot of American shooters to be able to deal with. They're not necessarily going to have a lot of holster options out on the market. You're probably going to have to pursue custom options. Magazines might be a little bit more difficult to find. There's a lot of things that impact these not being the best choices. But I could see myself picking that over a Pocket 32. However, if we change the 32 option over to a Beretta Model 81, a little bit bigger pistol, a little bit higher capacity, better, though not the greatest sights to work with, maybe a little bit more holster option available out there, the Beretta Model 81, in comparison to a Makarov or a CZ82, is definitely winning, especially when you take into account that 32 ACP being a light recoiling cartridge. If you combine that with a heavier frame and a larger handgun to be able to grip, you could really probably pull off some amazing groups with the 32 ACP cartridge out of that Beretta Model 81. And that's a very interesting option, kind of throwing back to our shot placement people when it comes to that particular discussion. So, as with all things, there's a lot of stuff that impact this decision, and a lot of things that go a lot of different ways. What are my recommendations when it comes to 32 ACP? My overall recommendation is that 32 is on the wrong side of minimal. In my opinion, 380 is the minimum defensive cartridge that I am willing to carry. So 32 is just on the other side of that. And because of available options, so is 9x18 Makarov, but that's a separate discussion for another day. Now, if you were to tell me that you're going to consistently carry that 32 pocket pistol, okay. If that's something that you're going to practice with, if that's something that you are comfortable with, that's a pure preference thing. I'm not going to get in the way of it. I would not dissuade you from doing that, but I would implore you to seek out more potent options if given the possibility. As soon as you get the chance, if you could carry a 9mm, if the situation supports you carrying a Glock 19 or a SIG P365, that would be what I would push you to do more so than carry a 32. But at the end of the day, the gun that you have is the gun that matters. Now, what are my uses for the 32 ACP? My uses pretty much come down to being a military collector. That would be my interest in it. Any of the surplus options that were chambered in 32 ACP would be what I would want in my collection, not as defensive options, just as the joy of collecting. Because one of the things that I am in my own firearms collection is a collector. Now, something else that I find very interesting about the 32 ACP is when you look at things like the VZ61 Scorpion, which is a machine pistol designed by Czechoslovakia when it still existed. And this is very interesting because machine pistols have a tendency to be a little difficult to maintain control of. For example, the Glock 18, not the easiest handgun to be able to keep on target in full auto. However, something that's a little bit lighter recoiling and that you can get two hands wrapped around, like the VZ61, would probably be really easy to keep on target. And then you've got that full automatic firepower that you could bring to bear against as many targets as you see necessary. That's an interesting option to me. I think that's a really cool little niche that the 32 ACP could occupy outside of just being a pocket pistol. It takes advantage of the compactness capability of the cartridge with also things that would actually be very beneficial in a gunfight if, the average person could own full automatic handguns, which would be really nice, but these are the times we live in, I guess. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. Now, if you enjoyed this content and you want a little bit more interaction with it, you should check out the Murph's Law Facebook page. I'll put a link in the description. This is a great opportunity to be able to impact or put in video requests, have discussions with people, be able to see some behind-the-scenes stuff that's going on, especially since I've got some content coming up that I would love to have some of you guys' input in. So check out the Murph's Law Facebook page and say hi. All right, guys, and with that, that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.